this morning's and this evening's lesson is taken from the scripture that's found in Exodus chapter 19. While you're turning over there, I might just point out a little bit of background for today's ideas and lessons, especially this AM. You might recall when Moses responded to God's call, that God made a promise to Moses. And that promise is found in Exodus 3 and verse 12. And here's what God told Moses. He said, "Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain." We've kind of come full circle to this promise that God made to Moses a long time ago. And basically what God told Moses in that promise was that here's how he would know that God had sent him, that one day they would come back to this very mountain where God first called and commissioned Moses to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. And there he and the Israelites would worship God. What we have to understand is, and think about, is more of I think a personal state of mind that Moses is in at this time. Because it has to be, this promise that God made to Moses has to be glaring in the back of his mind. It has to be very evident to him that 3 months after they had left Egypt, that they've arrived at the very mountain that God promised they would arrive at. And when they arrive at this mountain, they set up their tents and they set up camp at the base of this mountain. And this is where God is going to establish his covenant with the children of Israel. What I want for us to concentrate on this morning is there's an attention-getting statement that's made by God in this section that's recorded in verse 5. And here's what God says to the children of Israel. He says, "Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people." The two words that I want us to think about and focus upon in this verse this morning, in the King James Version, they're translated as peculiar treasure. The word peculiar, as it was used back in the 1600s, doesn't really mean the same thing as it means to us today. When I think of peculiar, I think of something strange or odd. And so God wasn't saying you're going to be strange or odd people to me. But some of the modern day translations, the New King James Version translates it as a special treasure. Some others say where it makes it very personal. And that's really the implication of the words. The idea is something that you possess that solely belongs to you. And because you alone possess it, it is very valuable. It is something that you assign worth and value. It is something that you treasure very much. And so some versions translate it as saying, God saying, my own special treasure or property, or even my treasured possession. But think about the meaning of that and the implications of that for the Israelites. What were the Israelites up to this point? When you think about them in the context of Egyptian slavery, basically they were a bunch of nobodies and nothings. But now they could be somebody and they could be something. Not just somebody and something, but a people that God valued above all others. A people that God treasured above all nations upon the earth. And so they had this opportunity before them to become and to be something that not everybody gets to be. Moses, when the children of Israel eventually entered the promised land in the book of Deuteronomy, he reminds them of this great opportunity and privilege that God laid before them. In Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 6, he says, "For thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth." One of the key words in that verse is the idea of being chosen. And I think probably all of us at some level and degree understand the value and the specialness of being chosen. I can think back to a kid whenever we would have games and you would get to choose your teammates. Who do you want on your team? And I remember the value and the worth and the specialness that you felt whenever you were chosen by somebody to be on their team. There are a lot of us in the audience this morning who understand the value of being chosen in one of the most special relationships, human relationships that we can share here upon this earth. Because those of us who are married have been chosen by our spouses.
And so there's a very great value and worth that is assigned to the idea of being chosen. But that choice and that worth and that value is magnified when we make the statement, God chose you. And so Israel has this opportunity to be chosen by God above every other nation upon the face of the earth, above all other people, to be something special, something valued, something that is treasured by God Himself. I think in our society today, people have kind of adapted this mindset and this mentality about being chosen. There's almost this idea of it's something that just people don't like. They don't like other people to be valued above others. They don't like other people to be thought about as being precious above whether it's another nation or other people. But God says, I've chosen. And what we have to understand about this choosing is God chose the nation of Israel for a very special purpose, for a privilege from which every other nation was going to be excluded. And that was to bring His Son into this world to bless all people and nations and languages. And what I want to emphasize is we think about this idea of Israel being God's special treasure. God did not say that He is going to be Israel's special possession to be used for their benefit and their purpose. That's not what God said. God said, I'm going to choose you, and I'm going to choose you to be my special possession, and I'm going to use you for my benefit and my purposes. And so what we have to understand is there a sense in which all nations of the earth belong to the Lord? Yes, God made everybody. God is the sustainer of all those nations. But God chose Israel above all other nations. That doesn't mean, a couple ideas to think about, that doesn't mean that they were better than any other nation. Only they were different. They were set apart by the Lord for His special work and His plan and His purposes. And so what I want us to think about today is the idea of being something or someone who is extremely valuable in the sight of God. Somebody who is of great worth to Him. Because what the Bible teaches us as Christians, we have that same intrinsic value to God that the nation of Israel had to Him in the Old Testament. We are of great worth and value in His sight, and God has chosen us and set us apart for some very special plans and purposes and works that He has in mind. But what did it take for Israel to be God's special treasure? And what does it take for us to be God's special treasure today? Well, one of the first areas that we read about in verse 6, one of the first ways that the children of Israel were going to be special to God is they were going to be His priests. And I know that later on, as we're studying through the book of Exodus, we'll read about the building of the tabernacle. We'll read about the establishment of the priesthood and the high priesthood. And later on, Aaron and his sons are going to be consecrated and officially anointed as priests to serve within the tabernacle. And then, of course, later on within the temple. But what I want to point out this morning is, from the beginning, it was God's intent that all Israel was going to be His priest. That all Israel was going to live as His priest. And when you think about priests in the Old Testament, what was the significance of a priest? Well, a priest was basically authorized to serve in very sacred matters, holy matters to God. They were authorized to bring people into a relationship with God. They were authorized to help people get closer to God, to help them stay nearer to Him. They also played a tremendous role in teaching the children of Israel. They taught them about sin. They taught them about how to make amends whenever they violated God's law. They taught about God's laws of forgiveness. They taught about how to worship God. You know, you think about priests, in short, they were kind of this indispensable source of religious knowledge to the people. And they were this channel through which spiritual life was communicated to God's people. And we're going to look at a couple of scriptures here, some implications that come along with being a priest, some things that just go hand in hand with it. And I'm going to say in the beginning, I know a lot of these verses that we're going to read, or most of them are about the high priest. And you might say, well, we're reading about a high priest here, not a regular priest. But the same things that are said about the high priest, in principle, are said about a regular priest of God too. And so I just want to emphasize that as we go through it. The first thing that I'll point out to you is, what did it mean to be a priest of God? It meant that God chose you. You were a divine choice of God. In fact, when you go back to the book of Hebrews and talking about the high priest, that's one of the things that's pointed out in chapter 5 and verse 1. The Hebrew writer said, "For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins." Being a priest of God meant being chosen by God himself. Why did the priesthood exist? Well, the priesthood existed because God created the office. He's the one who ordained and came up with the idea, the principle of being a priest. But how was a priest appointed to an office? Well, God himself was the one who appointed them. In fact, if you go down to verse 4 of Hebrews chapter 5, the Hebrew writer said, "And no man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron." How did Aaron become a high priest? Well, he didn't just become a high priest. One day the people didn't all get together and say, "Now we're going to take a vote. Who do you want to be your high priest?" He didn't become a high priest because one day he decided, I'd like to run for the office of a high priest, and so I'm going to elect myself or appoint myself as a candidate for being a high priest. The way that these men got into office was God chose these people. God divinely appointed them. Think about the priesthood in the Old Testament. Could just any person enter into the tabernacle and minister and serve there? No, there were only certain people that God had chosen. Mainly speaking of the tribe of Levi. Certain people who could officiate at the official worship and service of God in the tabernacle and in the temple. And so divine selection made a priest different from everybody else. If you think about it, even Jesus himself, who the Bible describes as our great high priest, he didn't come into this world on his own accord. He was divinely sent, wasn't he? He was divinely appointed to come, and what he did here was specially assigned to him by the Father. He gave him his job and his office and his mission. And so the idea of being a priest of God carried with it heavenly credentials. The second implication about being a priest of God is that it implies the idea of representation. If you turn back a couple chapters in the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 17, the Hebrew writer says, "Wherefore in all things it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren." He's speaking of Christ here. "That he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God." Now notice this, "to make reconciliation for the sins of the people." Every priest enjoyed individual access to God and to the throne of God. But there was something else that was great about being a priest of God. You not only had this personal, individual access to God, but you also had the responsibility of kind of being a bridge between God and other people. You had a responsibility of representing other people before the throne of God. And so the office was given as God's provision for people who were at a distance from him. The priest appeared in the divine presence of God on behalf of another person. And so in a sense, he was the mediator on behalf of those who were guilty. One of the best illustrations that I know of this is found in the Old Testament in the idea of the high priesthood there. In Exodus chapter 28, God is going over the official dress that was to be made for the high priest. And remember that the high priest was supposed to wear an ephod. And there were certain things that were supposed to be put on this outer robe and jacket that he wore. In verse 9 of Exodus 28, we read about one of them. It says, "Thou shalt take 2 onyx stones, and grave on them the names of the children of Israel. 6 of their names on one stone, and the other 6 names on the rest of the other stone, according to their birth." And if you go down to verse 12, it says, "And thou shalt put the 2 stones upon the shoulders of the ephod, for the stones of memorial unto the children of Israel. And Aaron shall bear their names before the Lord upon his 2 shoulders for a memorial." You have that idea of representation in the priest. It was represented in terms that we can better understand. Where the children of Israel, there were 2 stones. Half of the tribes were written on one stone. half the tribes were written upon the other. It was put upon the shoulders of the high priest, the ephod that he wore. And when he came before God, he was carrying the tribes before God. He was representing all the people as he stood before God. And so the Bible teaches us that in a sense, his official actions were actually the actions of the children of Israel, because he was a representative upon their part. And so they had this tremendous responsibility of bridging this gap, of representing people before God himself. There's another implication that comes along with being a priest of God too. It implies that you have something to offer, gifts and sacrifices to God. In Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 3, the Hebrew writer again says, "For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, whereof it is of necessity that this man has somewhat also to offer." I don't know if there's a principle that's made any more or any clearer in the Scripture than the idea of a priest. The function of a priest was to give gifts and offerings to God. The chief duty, we might say, of a priest was to offer up gifts and sacrifices to God. And so you have this idea. God says, you're going to be special to me. How are we going to be special? You're going to be my priest. That means I'm going to choose you. I'm going to divinely choose you to an office where you not only have individual access to my throne, but you have the opportunity to represent others, to bridge the gap that exists between me and them by offering gifts and sacrifices. And you might look at that in the Old Testament. You might think, well, yeah, that's what God said to the children of Israel, right? But you know, in the New Testament, the same thing is said to us as Christians. In fact, in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 6, John is writing there about the idea that Jesus has made us to be, he says in that verse, kings and priests. The exact thing that God's people got to be in the Old Testament, Christians are today. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, Paul besought the church at Rome that they offered spiritual sacrifices to God, which he says is your reasonable or your logical service. And so while in the Old Testament these priests offered up physical animal sacrifices, we're offering up gifts and sacrifices to God today. And because we're priests of God, that makes us valuable in his sight. That makes us something special. And so God chose them to be special by choosing them to be priests. The second idea that made them special is God chose them to be holy. If you look back in Exodus 19 and verse 6, he says, "Ye shall be unto me an holy nation." And that is simply a people that is set apart for God. Holiness is a theme that's emphasized about God's people throughout the pages of the Bible. But I don't know of a book that emphasizes it more than the book of Leviticus. I know a lot of times when we think about the book of Leviticus, we think, man, that's a boring book. You know, all it is a bunch of rules and laws and commandments of God. But do you know what those rules and those laws and those commandments of God did? It made the children of Israel different, didn't it? It made them distinct from everybody else. And at least 6 times in that book, you'll read the concept of the reason that the children of Israel had all these laws and all these commandments and these ordinances. In fact, if you go down in Leviticus chapter 11 and read verses 44 and 45, it's actually mentioned twice here in these 2 verses. God said to Israel, he said, "For I am the Lord your God, ye shall therefore sanctify yourselves, and ye shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall ye defile yourselves with any manner of creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. For I, the Lord that bringeth you out of the land of Egypt to be your God, or I am the Lord that bringeth you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Ye shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." God wanted his people to be distinct and separate and different from everybody else, because God says, I am distinct. I am different. I am separate from everybody else. They were to be a people who reflected the very nature of God. They were different from all other people and all other nations because they were reflecting the nature of God himself to everybody else. And God says time and time again throughout the book of Leviticus, he says, You be different and you be separate and distinct because I am different and I am separate and distinct. There are many areas of holiness that the Bible describes to us, and I want you to think about specifically the areas of the children of Israel. But the idea of being different and distinct and separate because God is different and distinct and separate is not just an Old Testament concept, it's a New Testament concept today for us as Christians. Peter would write in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 15 and 16, he says, "But as he hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, because it is written, Be ye holy, for I am holy." What areas does God want us to be different and distinct and separate in from everybody else? And the answer is found right there in 1 Peter 1 and verse 15. All manner of conversation. All of our conduct, all of our living here upon this earth should be different from the world that we live in. And you think about the children of Israel. How were the children of Israel different because Jehovah was their God? The answer is every aspect of their life. I mean, you think about that included what they ate and what they didn't eat. It included the clothes that they wore. It included who they married. It included even how they buried their dead and how they worshiped God. They were distinct and separate and different in about every area of life from everybody else. And so how does God want us to be different from everybody else today? The answer is in all manner of conversation, in all areas of conduct, in the way that we think, in the way that we speak, in the way that we dress, the way that we act. There ought to be a separation, a distinctiveness that exists between the children of God and the people of this world. And I think sometimes what we miss is really, what does it mean when we talk about being different or separate? I think sometimes the true meaning of the idea of holiness is lost. I love how Paul puts it in 2 Corinthians 6 and verses 17 and 18. He says, "Wherefore come ye out from among them, and be ye separate, and touch not the unclean thing. And I will receive you, saith the Lord, and I will be unto you a father, and ye shall be unto me my sons, saith the Lord God Almighty." You think about the idea of being separate. God, as Christians, I think sometimes we develop this concept where we think being separate from the world means we go out here and we live our lives in our own little corner of the world, and we just kind of leave the world alone and let them do their own thing. That's not the separateness that God describes there. There is supposed to be a distinctiveness that exists between us and the world. But it's not a distinctiveness from the world. We don't separate ourselves from everybody who lives in this world. We live in this world, the Bible tells us, and Jesus himself said, but there is a distinctiveness in our living. There is a distinctiveness in the way that we conduct ourselves versus the way that the world conducts themselves. There's a distinctiveness in our speech versus the way that the world speaks. Every way that we think about being different and separate and holy, it's not separating ourselves totally from the world and the people that live in it, but it's standing out among them. And so as Christians, we have to understand, and as priests of God in the Old Testament, those were the people who God chose to set the bar and set the example for everybody else. And to teach other people the idea of the concept of holiness and distinctiveness, things that the Bible talks about in the Old Testament, the difference between clean and unclean things. And so when you think about how can we be special to God today, how can we be valued and held in extreme worth of God, the answer is to be holy, to be different and distinct from all other people. The third area that I want us to think about this morning that would make Israel God's special treasure is if they did everything the Lord had told them to do. In fact, when you go back to verse 5 here in Exodus chapter 19, here's what God says. He says, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be unto me a special treasure above all people." When you go down to verse 8 of that same chapter, it says, "And all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord." The third way that they were going to be valued and treasured above all other people is because they were going to do everything that the Lord told them to do. You know, you think about society and men today, and I would venture to say that probably, I couldn't really think of anybody that you couldn't say it of, but I would venture to say that if you looked at about every individual on the earth today, I know we could probably find a lot of things in their life where we say they're not doing what God told them to do. But I can almost imagine you can find some area where you could say they are doing what God told them to do. It's not the case that everybody on the earth is just totally disobeying God in every area of their life, right? The difference between the children of Israel and all the other people on the earth was they were going to do everything that God told them to do. They were going to be faithful to God in all areas of their life, not just here and there choose what they like and what they don't like, or what's easy for them versus what's hard for them. They were going to go wherever God told them to go. They were going to do whatever God told them to do. And so if we want to be valued to God, be value and worth to God, if we want to be held in high esteem, we need to be faithful in all areas of our life. It's easy to be faithful to God in those areas that aren't challenging. But it's a lot harder. It's a lot more valuable whenever we're faithful to God in those areas that don't come naturally to us, that aren't as easy to endure. And so Israel, think about the opportunity. You know, they hadn't even heard the law yet. They didn't even know what God was going to require of them. But they say, whatever He tells us, we're going to do it. We want to be valuable. We want this special place in God's purpose and in His plan. And shouldn't that be the same mentality as Christians today? Shouldn't our mentality be, I don't care what God tells me to do, I'm going to do it. I don't care where God tells me to go, I'm going to go. Because I want to be God's special treasure. I want to have that relationship with Him and to be valued in His sight above all other people here upon this earth. Israel had a great opportunity that lay before them, but for us today as Christians, we learn we have that same opportunity too. We have the opportunity to be God's special treasure. In fact, Peter borrows this imagery of Exodus 19 and verse 6 in 1 Peter 2 and verse 9. And here's what he says about us as the Lord's church today. He says, "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of Him who hath called you out of darkness into His marvelous light." Like Israel of old, God's people today have to point others toward the Lord. They have to reveal His character and reflect His character in our holiness, in our distinctiveness in our lives that we live here upon this earth. We might simply say we have to be living advertisements for God. The question becomes, how do we do that? Well, we studied about it this morning. First of all, we have to understand we have an open access, individual access to the throne of God. But it's not just for us as a priest of God, it's for others too. And so the priests of God in the Old Testament, they brought others closer to God. They mended relationships between God and people. They helped to bridge the gap that existed between them. How did they do it? By making sacrifices to and for God. How did they stand out? How were they special to God? They were being holy and different and distinct from the rest of the world. That's true today in the way that we walk, the way that we talk, dress, act, worship. Everything that we do should reflect the nature of our God to a world who does not know Him. And the third way that we become special to God, just like Israel in the Old Testament, by doing whatever the Lord tells us to do. By going wherever He tells us to go, and by performing whatever He tells us to perform. Maybe there's one here present in our audience this morning who doesn't have that idea, that sense of being special in the sight of God. The great lesson for each one of us is it's not limited to one person or one nation today. Anyone and everyone who wants to be God's special treasure can be it. But the way that we become it is by obedience to His commands. If you're not yet a child of God this morning, why not become one? Why not obey the